What's happening? There we go. So I'll just read your bio real quick to introduce the group to you. Dr. Nicole Jaguar is the USDA Veterinary Medical Officer and Scrapie designated epidemiologist and local point of contact for New England states and I don't know why it says and Rhode Island, because Rhode Island is part of New England.
We kicked them out. I don't know.
Yeah, so also them. Dr. Jaguar has served as the USDA APHIS VS designated Scrapie epidemiologist since 2017 and also as a USDA VMO since 2011. Her duties include serving as a foreign animal disease diagnostician for New Hampshire, import and export work and disease eradication efforts with livestock species, including cattle, sheep, goats, swine, and poultry. She is also heavily involved with the USDA's highly pathogenic avian influenza outbreak response, including deploying as a member of one of Veterinary Services incident management teams. So welcome, Dr. Jaguar. We're looking forward to your presentation.
All right, I will try to speak quickly and get you all through this. So I was asked today to give a little bit of an update on the Scrapie eradication program. So I'm going to go through just some brief information about the disease itself, as well as transmission, diagnosis, and how we can get samples submitted and kind of when you should call if you're concerned about it. So as many of you may or may not recall from vet school, Scrapie is the oldest known TSC, transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, in the same family as mad cow disease, for example. The original cases, the origin is unknown. However, there was an increased incidence in the 18th and 19th centuries, coinciding with the export of sheep from Spain and interbreeding to improve wool quality. It is not believed to be a zoonotic, although experimental infection has occurred between other species. It's first recorded in Great Britain in 1732, so it's been here with us for a while. And the first U.S. case was in 1947 in Michigan from an imported UK origin sheep through Canada. So, as usual, our international trade routes played a role. So, as I mentioned, Scrapie is a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy that affects sheep and goats. It's related to mad cow disease. It is always fatal, degenerative disease that affects the CNS and is caused by a prion, which, as hopefully you recall, is an abnormally folded cellular protein. There are two forms, generally speaking, of Scrapie. So we have our classical form, which is usually transmitted from ewe to offspring, or to other lambs and kids in lambing and kidding group through birth fluids. Typically, there is a 2 to 5 year incubation period that can vary some depending on route of transmission. Unfortunately, the clinical signs tend to be, at least the beginning, tend to be rather vague. So basically, you know, an ADR sheep not doing right. Weight loss, behavioral changes. Frequently, you'll see circling as the animal moves away, and difficulty, ataxia. You may see itching and wool loss, which is how Scrapie got its name. Bunny hops, tremors, and weakness. The other form of Scrapie is the non-classical or atypical NOR98 version. It is either not transmitted or poorly transmitted under natural conditions and is thought to be a sporadic occurrence. Typically, it's found in older animals, older than 5 as a general rule of thumb. We see up to 12, 13. Rarely show clinical signs and is not handled in the same method in terms of regulatory restrictions as classical Scrapie is. So as I mentioned, the clinical signs tend to be very varied and often somewhat vague. For transmission, Scrapie is not an inherited disease. It is primarily spread through exposure to placental or birth fluids, whether that's through ingestion, ocular exposure, or contact with abraded skin or mucous membranes. So you either see vertical amongst the birth cohort or horizontal transmission. And eradicating prions from the environment can be very difficult, which is one of the things that makes handling this in a flock a difficult situation. So as I mentioned, the impact of age at exposure really dictates how quickly you'll see the disease progress. So if the sheep or goat is exposed at or near birth, they typically die by 72 months of age. However, if they are exposed after weaning, so for example, when another ewe in their lambing group gives birth and they're exposed that way, they typically die at more than 72 months of age, although that is not always the case. Luckily, there is some genetic resistance to Scrapie. Polymorphisms in the genes that code for the prions. You'll see codon 171, which codes for susceptibility to valine independent Scrapie. There's two polymorphisms there, Q or R. So QQ is most susceptible, RR is most resistant. We encourage folks to utilize RR RAMs in an attempt to get that QR or RR result in their lambs. You can also see polymorphisms in the codon 136, and that codes for susceptibility to valine-dependent Scrapie, which is less common in the US. And typically the polymorphisms are A and V. So you can see AV or VV are more susceptible. AA would be somewhat more resistant. Goats, there's still a lot of research ongoing to estimate the national prevalence of the alleles believed to be connected to resistance in goats. So that's S146 and K222, which have been linked to classical Scrapie resistance. So the goals in determining the prevalence of these alleles is related to how we handle cases of Scrapie in goats. So an attempt to reduce the number of animals that are removed as part of a flock cleanup plan or herd cleanup plan if a flock or herd is diagnosed with Scrapie. So if we can remove the highly susceptible animals from that herd, sometimes we can allow for continued monitoring as opposed to having to depopulate the entire herd. Also, it would be useful to encourage selective breeding of goats the same way that we have for sheep to encourage resistance in higher risk herds. So approximately 3,000 samples from all 50 states were taken over the last several years, and that data is currently being analyzed. For diagnosis, we have a couple of options. There are some live animal tests available. Looking at lymphoid tissue in one of two places, either the third eyelid, and you can see that in the picture up to, let me get my laser pointer, over here on the right, where they're harvesting some of that lymphoid tissue in the third eyelid, or you can opt for a rectal biopsy. And then you're looking for the tissue along the mucocutaneous junction right in here, and you want roughly a nickel-sized piece of tissue. That being said, while there is live animal testing available, the test has limited diagnostic value. Unfortunately, it really only has predictive value. So if the animal comes back positive on a live animal test, then we know that the animal has Scrapie. However, if the animal comes back negative, that does not rule out Scrapie as a possible diagnosis. So quite frankly, we don't use this testing very often. If we have a case that we suspect is clinical, we simply observe the animal. If it is in fact Scrapie, the animal will continue to progress and will pass away. Even if it passed away for other reasons or is euthanized, we'll do a postmortem sample and then we get a definitive diagnosis that way. So the live animal testing is used in limited situations. So as I mentioned, the postmortem testing is really the gold standard that we utilize. So there are a couple of tissues that we can harvest looking for that. The most critical or most highly prioritized tissues would be the obex, which is part of the brainstem. Happily, this is easily accessible if the skull is removed from the spinal column. You can go right in through the foramen magnum and harvest it right out through there. And that's that spot where you'll see this little V on the spinal column, and that's the obex. So that is the sample that we aim for. In non-clinical animals, if we're just doing regular surveillance sampling, we try to get the obex as well as a retropharyngeal lymph node in case there are issues with the obex samples. Sometimes if the brain has started to autolyze or if we miss the correct location, having that medial retropharyngeal lymph node allows for another testing option. For animals that are clinical, we will try to get a few other samples as well. In clinical cases, we aim for both formalin preserved tissues as well as fresh tissues. So we would want to get the obex cross-section, half of the brain, a tonsil, and a lymph node if possible, and put that in formalin. And then for fresh tissue, we would want to get half of the cerebellum, left half of the brain, or a half of the brain for the cerebrum, tonsil, and another lymph node. In addition to that, we also collect ear tissue on all of our samples whenever we could do that, preferably with the official identification attached. And that can be used for genetic testing should the animal be determined to be positive. And what that allows for is looking at the resistance and provides a few options down the road and how the flock is handled as part of that flock cleanup plan. So we have the National Scrapie Eradication Program. The goal of this program, obviously, is to get rid of Scrapie here in the US. Currently, only 2 countries are considered to be Scrapie-free. That's Australia and New Zealand. So if we were able to join them, that would really increase the value of our sheep and goat exports. So the last detection of Scrapie in sheep by fiscal year has been at least, well, unfortunately, except for good old Arkansas, which was a little bit more than a year ago, and Pennsylvania, but most of the country has had no cases within the last 7 years, so that's been pretty exciting. And then for goats, we're in a similar situation. 2 cases that had cases, I'm sorry, 2 states that have had cases more than 2 years ago, whereas the rest of the United States had no cases for 7 years. So we're making really good progress on this. Prevalence is very, very low. But unfortunately, because well, not unfortunately, but because the prevalence is so low, it makes detecting those last cases a lot more difficult. So the National Scrapie Eradication Program continues to have to be in effect with the goal of finding the last remaining cases. And then after we've done that, to maintain high level of surveillance for 7 years to demonstrate freedom to the world. So our National Scrapie Eradication Program has 3 components. The first is Scrapie surveillance. We have to prove that we are actually looking for Scrapie. You know, as we always joke, the easiest way to eradicate disease is stop testing for it. But obviously our trade partners want some sort of assurance for that. So we're working with the World Organization for Animal Health to maintain a Scrapie surveillance program that meets our trade partners' standards. In addition to that, we have mandatory sheep and goat identification program, and that is to allow us to trace cases in the event that we did have a Scrapie case. And then we have a voluntary component in the Scrapie flock certification program. So as part of our Scrapie surveillance, we have recently revamped a bit of our surveillance program, and we are now trying to aim slightly more, in a more targeted fashion to really drill down on those remaining cases of Scrapie. So we're trying to redistribute our sampling from lower risk populations to those underrepresented populations in our historic testing, trying to find those little pockets where disease might still be lurking. So again, that's going to be those undersampled populations, small rural flocks. For example, we are trying to increase sampling for on-farm deaths and clinical suspects. So those animals that are higher risk of having Scrapie in the first place, as opposed to the samples that we take at slaughter, where primarily we're seeing young, healthy animals. And they're now utilizing, and actually I shouldn't have said points, but an incentive program to try and redirect sampling to those populations. Personally, I think the points versus incentive is a little bit of a semantics issue, but at any rate, it's they are adjusting how we count samples and how we credit samples to, again, put greater value and greater emphasis on those clinical or on-farm death animals. In addition to that, we also have an annual sampling minimum for each state here in New England, well, across the country. So here in New England, this shows you the, oh, I forgot to update the year, I apologize. This is for fiscal year 2023. So that would be October of 2022 to the end of September of 2023. My apologies, I swiped the slide and didn't update it. So here in Maine, or there in Maine, I guess, since I'm in New Hampshire, we need to get at least 30 sheep samples and 13 goat samples over the course of the year. We've been fairly lucky in the last few years, and we've been able to make our samples sampling minimums, which is good. But of course, we don't limit ourselves to that. We continue to always try and get additional samples, especially, as I mentioned, in those clinical or on-farm deaths. Most of the samples that we count towards these minimums are taken from slaughter surveillance, and I'll explain what that is in a little bit here. So this goes over a little bit about the risk-based credits for on-farm submissions. Yeah, on-farm submissions. Sorry. And there are two risk factors that they've used to develop the credit system. So the first is age, and the second is clinical signs. So we're looking for animals that are within the most likely age range to be showing Scrapie. So typically that's going to be 18 to 72 months. You can see that point value is the highest in animals with those classic clinical signs. But even in animals with no clinical signs, animals in that age range are worth more than animals that are, you know, at the very young end of the spectrum or the very old end of the spectrum where we wouldn't expect to see clinical signs. So we also can look for susceptible genotypes. That really only comes into play for on-farm sampling. We don't know the genetics for our RSSS samples, which are our regulatory Scrapie slaughter surveillance program. And then there's also a limit to cap the number of incentive credits that would count towards the state's minimum animal requirement. So as you saw on the last slide, for example, a 3-year-old sheep with clinical signs would count for 30 credits. Well, in Maine, that would be their entire sampling minimum. And so we could, you know, if we didn't have that cap on 30%, we could sample one animal in Maine and meet that requirement. And obviously that means we're missing a whole lot of other samples. So risk factors, as I mentioned, clinical signs, the classical clinical signs that we're really looking for, that we really want to target, are any sort of CNS signs, intense rubbing at the wool with hair loss or wool loss. Typically in these situations, the flock or herd would qualify for indemnity, so we might be able to pay for that animal. However, there would have to be some documentation associated with that. In cases where there are less specific clinical signs, such as non-ambulatory prior to slaughter or death, animals that were condemned by FSIS for non-clinical, non-CNS signs rather, sorry. Poor body condition, obviously a lot of things can cause that, or death of an unknown cause. So those would count as less clinical, but still worth testing. Another risk factor, as we discussed earlier, is age. So as I mentioned, animals between 18 and 72 months of age are the most likely to demonstrate clinical signs of classical Scrapie. So those are the animals that we're wanting to target. So what we look for is those initial incisors, adult incisors. And usually if we see those, well, in cases where we don't have an animal history, those are the animals that we target up to about 5 years of age. So again, this kind of goes over these first two targeting criteria only apply to slaughter surveillance animals. For on-farm, we're looking for all clinical suspects, regardless of age or breed. And then, of course, any animal that is enrolled in the Scrapie flock certification program is eligible, for all adult animals, are eligible for testing. So as I mentioned, we have a couple of sample sources. The regulatory Scrapie slaughter surveillance program, the RSSS program, is run typically by vet services, whether we send our staff in to collect the samples at the slaughterhouse, or we have some slaughterhouses who will collect and preserve the samples for us, and then we just pick them up and submit them. And that is probably where the vast majority of our samples come from. That being said, those are also typically the low value samples, the unlikely to have Scrapie samples. So our non-slaughter surveillance options include trace investigation. So if we had an investigation from an infected flock in another state or, anywhere, that would provide some samples. We also don't see a whole lot of those. Obviously, we're not, thankfully, finding a lot of Scrapie positive flocks. So our next best, or probably our most valuable source would be on-farm sampling. So there are a couple options for on-farm sampling. As you've heard me mention several times, found dead animals. Any sheep or goat that is found, an adult animal that is found dead or euthanized, we would be interested in sampling for Scrapie. And so this is sort of where we beg for your assistance on this. And I'll cover in a little bit how you can report that to us. But we really count on our veterinarians and our producer relationships to get a chance to access those samples. Public health laboratories. So as most of you probably recall, anytime you have a neurologic animal, the first thought in your head should be rabies. We always encourage testing for rabies prior to testing for Scrapie. That supersedes any of our needs for Scrapie testing. That being said, we do have agreements with many public health labs that we can obtain the samples after they've tested negative for rabies, and then we ship that out for testing for Scrapie. So if you are submitting an animal for rabies, a sheep or goat for rabies testing, by all means reach out to USDA, excuse me, and we can try and make arrangements to get those samples from the public health lab. And then veterinary diagnostics laboratories. So we have agreements in place with a number of labs in New England, primarily UNH and Yukon, but we are always working to expand that to obtain samples from any sheep or goats that are submitted for necropsy there. And typically the USDA will pay for a portion of the necropsy costs towards that to incentivize the owner to allow it and the lab to collect the samples for us. And then we do, as I mentioned, have an option for live animal testing. Again, we very rarely utilize that. It just doesn't have a ton of value for us, or for the producer for that matter. And typically USDA, there's some costs associated with that for the producer rather. And so, especially if they're doing genotyping ahead of time. So we don't use that too much here in New England. And then, of course, our third sample source is the Scrapie flock certification program. Any members who are, or any flocks or herds that are members of that program in the export category are required to submit a certain number of samples every year, as well as report any found deads and allow testing of those animals. So sample submissions. There are several options that you can offer to clients if you have clients who do have sheep or goats that pass away. First option would be for you to collect the samples. If that's something that you're interested in doing, you can reach out to us. We'll be happy to set you up with training materials. We can do hands-on training. We'll get you the forms. We'll get you all the supplies that you need and go over that whole process with you. We also have a whole head submission option. So in that case, simply the head is removed. There's a packing box that you can keep on hand, and you put the head in the box and you ship it off to a lab in Indiana. They collect the appropriate samples and submit that. And then, as I mentioned, if the animal is being tested for rabies, we can work with the public health lab to get the remaining tissue samples after that testing for submission. And then the third option is to notify VS and request collection. I will say that option is somewhat dependent on our staff availability. Grace, Dr. Norman, who's there with you, she's the only person we have in the state of Maine. Obviously, y'all have a big state. And so if she's otherwise occupied, she may not be able to get out there in a timely fashion. And so that is something that, we will try to do it when we can, but it's not something that we can guarantee, unfortunately, especially when they deploy us out for other disease outbreaks and so on. So that covers Scrapie surveillance. A couple other things I wanted to touch on. One of them was mandatory sheep and goat ID. So all sheep and goats over 18 months of age must be identified using official identification. So there are a couple of options there for that. The USDA does have serial metal tags that can be an option. Producers can opt to purchase plastic tabs if they prefer that route. But all of these tags, all official identification is going to have that US shield on it. There are also options for tattoos. However, those must be linked to registration papers and they must be legible, which I'm sure many of you have experienced is sort of a hit or miss thing until people kind of get the hang of it. And then the last option is electronic implants, such as microchips. Microchips tend to be somewhat discouraged because of the potential for the animals to enter the food chain. And of course, it's not a visual ID, and so the animal is required to travel with a microchip reader if it's moving. And so obviously any animals that are entering the slaughter or the livestock auction chains, that is a significant impediment there. Oops, and I'm sorry, I apologize too, I didn't take that out. So ear tags are unfortunately no longer being offered for free, except for new flocks enrolling in the ID program. They get a limited number of tags. So in addition to all sheep and goats over 18 months of age being required to be identified, all sheep and goats leaving the premises of birth must be identified prior to leaving, or when a change of ownership occurs, unless they're going straight to slaughter. And then flock owners are required to keep animal records for a minimum of 5 years. And those include animals of individual ID, sex, breed, date of acquisition, where the animal came from, whether it was a natural addition or purchase, birthday, if known, and then disposition and date of removal from the flock or herd. And those are really critical in tracing situations where if we did have a positive animal, we want to be sure, we reach out to the correct flocks to notify them of exposure and how long that animal was on that premises, as well as whether or not it was there during, whether it birthed on the premises or was there during birthing. That all plays into the risk evaluation done for any individual animal. So the Scrapie Flock Certification Program is the last or the third component of the National Scrapie Eradication Program. As I mentioned, this is a voluntary program. It's designed for flock owners who wish to reduce or eliminate the risk of introducing Scrapie into their flocks. It was originally designed in the hope that it might increase the value of the flock, and it does allow for international export to some countries. However, it is a rather complicated program if the owners are interested in exporting the animals. And unfortunately, it's difficult for smaller flocks or herds. If you do have producers who are interested in joining that, I would recommend that you have them reach out to either myself or to Grace, and we can go through all of those requirements with them. But they are required, as you can see there, I wrote up quickly. There are restrictions on additions, what animals they can bring into the flock or herd. There are record keeping requirements. There are annual sampling requirements of the and inspection of animals before they're culled for the export category, and even the select category, which is a significant step down in requirement. There's no annual inspection that is required, but they are still required to submit a sample every 1 to 3 years, depending on the flock or herd size. And in many cases, for our flocks or herds that are pet sort of situations, they may not have an animal that dies every 1 to 3 years if they have good husbandry. And so that can really complicate their options. So in summary, how you can help, please encourage clients to follow the sheep and goat ID requirements. And remember that official ID is required for all sheep and goats that are being put onto a certificate of veterinary inspection. If you use other forms of ID without an official ID, those certificates will bounce back to you, and you'll get a scolding at the very least. But the certificates are not valid without an official form of ID. We do encourage you to encourage clients to submit or encourage submission of dead animals for necropsy and or Scrapie testing. The Scrapie testing itself is always free of charge. Necropsy services, as I said, the USDA pays a portion of that depending on which lab you're utilizing and what the specific agreement is for that lab. And then to encourage producers to notify veterinary services if they're sending adult animals to slaughter so that we can work with the slaughterhouse to take those samples as well. So that covers the Scrapie update. As I promised, speak quickly and get through it fast for you. That is my contact information, my cell number. There you are more than welcome to call, text, email. You can share that with clients. We're here to help. And yeah, any questions?
Looks like you've covered it well.
Try to keep it straightforward.
All right.